Hello everyone. Today I'm taking you back to the story of Thieu San, a very ordinary story, where quiet days pass within a familiar rhythm of life, filled with unspoken worries and emotions too deep to easily name. Let's continue walking alongside Thieu San to feel more clearly each small yet meaningful moment where love, hope, and new beginnings are quietly taking shape within the simplicity of everyday life over the past few days. Both Thieu San and Hai have been occupied with their own work. Each morning, Thieu San steps into the garden before daylight has fully arrived, when the surrounding space is still wrapped in its familiar quiet and the air carries the lingering chill of the night yet to fade. Early mist hovers close to the ground, clinging lightly to the low leaves, giving the garden a subdued, unhurried stillness. Only the occasional soft sound of insects breaks the silence, blending with the thin veil of dew that lingers between the vegetable beds. Behind her, the light inside the house still glows faintly, casting a small halo, just enough to reveal Thieu San's figure as she quietly walks into the garden, her familiar silhouette merging with the dimness of early morning. She bends down among the soil still damp with dew, her hands touching the cool earth as she begins to weed with steady patience. Each movement is slow but consistent, neither hurried nor hesitant. Thieu San's hands have long been accustomed to this work, moving with quiet certainty as she carefully separates each small weed from the base of the vegetables, mindful not to disturb the fragile young roots beneath. At times, she pauses briefly to examine a plant more closely before continuing, as though she knows every subtle change within her garden. After that, Thieu San lifts buckets of water and evenly waters the beds. The stream flows gently, soaking into the soil and spreading around each plant, leaving behind the familiar scent of damp earth. She moves from one row to the next, her steps light along the narrow paths between the beds. Walking slowly beside the tender rows of vegetables, she stops where closer attention is needed, bending down to study each leaf and each small stem. She straightens plants that have tilted from the night wind, gently removes withered leaves left behind, and sets them aside neatly. All of Thieu San's actions unfold in silence, without words or unnecessary sounds, just a familiar rhythm that has repeated itself day after day. Each task follows naturally, so steady and ingrained that it requires little thought, as if her body remembers every step on its own. In the quiet of the early morning, Thieu San continues her work, preparing to harvest the freshest vegetables to bring to the market as the day begins. By afternoon, she is once again standing in the middle of the crowded market, where laughter and chatter rise without pause and rounds of bargaining overlap, blending into the familiar soundscape of the late-day market. The atmosphere is noticeably livelier than in the morning, as buyers and sellers weave past one another through narrow aisles, constant footsteps keeping the small space in perpetual motion. The crowd grows thicker by the hour. Some people linger for a while in front of her vegetable stall, examining each bundle, asking a question or two before weighing their choice. Others glance briefly, nod in greeting, and hurry on, pressed by unfinished errands. These rhythms of movement intersect and overlap, forming a familiar cycle around Thieu San's small stall. She stands behind the counter, her figure absorbed into the noisy flow, yet preserving a quiet stillness of her own. Thieu San's eyes take in everything before her, accustomed to every look, every gesture, every subtle reaction customers make as they choose their vegetables. She doesn't need to watch for long to know who is merely browsing and who truly intends to buy. Her hands never stop moving, swiftly rearranging each bundle of greens, straightening baskets and trays so they remain neat and orderly. Whenever someone stops by, she gently draws a bundle forward, sets it out more clearly in view, a habit long ingrained, repeated without conscious thought. From early morning until dusk settles in, Thieu San scarcely has a moment of rest. After weighing vegetables for a customer and returning change, she bends down to wipe the surface of the stall, gathers stray leaves, and lines up the bundles again. These movements happen continuously, quick yet careful, efficient without haste. Even during brief lulls, when customers thin out for a moment, she doesn't stop to rest. Instead, she quietly adjusts the smallest details, from repositioning baskets for better balance to pulling the bundles closer together to help keep them fresh longer. As the afternoon light softens, casting a pale golden hue over the market, the voices and laughter remain, the flow of people continues, and Thieu San's stall retains its familiar neatness and order. Within the steady rhythm of the late-day market, her tasks repeat themselves, consistent, enduring, clearly reflecting the way Thieu San silently faces life each day. At the same time, Hai is busy preparing for the opening of his new office. Tasks follow one after another without pause, pressing in from early morning and filling his schedule tightly from the start of the day until late at night. His mornings usually begin with a series of back-to-back meetings, discussing progress, reviewing each item already underway, and adjusting details that are not yet fully settled. No sooner does one meeting end than he moves straight into the next, changing rooms and topics, yet always returning to the same figures, plans, and deadlines that must be met on time. Between these stretches of meetings, there is paperwork to handle, documents to review and sign, procedures to double-check so everything will run smoothly on the upcoming opening day. Hai spends long hours going over each file and list, cross-referencing information and correcting anything that remains incomplete. After that, he continues with arranging schedules, assigning personnel, and speaking in detail with each department to ensure everyone clearly understands their responsibilities. Everything must be calculated carefully, leaving no room for mistakes, which forces him to maintain a high level of concentration throughout the day. There are moments when he manages only a quick sip of water, briefly leaning back in his chair for a few short minutes before lowering his gaze to the packed schedule in front of him and returning to the familiar grind. Even after a long, exhausting day, when the last tasks finally ease and the space around him grows quieter, Hai still keeps his phone in hand. He leans back in his chair, his eyes resting on the glowing screen in an empty room, scrolling past familiar notifications before slowly pausing, waiting for a message from Thieu San. Sometimes the phone remains silent for quite a while, with no new signal appearing, yet he keeps it close by, glancing at it now and then, as if a single short line of text would be enough to slow his racing thoughts. In those brief moments, the busyness and tension of the day seem to fall away, giving space to a quiet, unspoken sense of anticipation that lingers amid the chain of endlessly busy days. Despite being occupied with their own work and packed schedules that stretch on day after day, they still quietly set aside a bit of care for each other through brief messages sent during the rare moments left between the relentless flow of work. Sometimes it is just a hastily typed question during a short pause, simple words appearing on the screen, unpolished and without much thought, yet enough to ask whether the other has eaten, is feeling tired, or whether the day has been especially heavy. The messages are sent quickly, often without emojis or overt emotion, just short lines of text, but the person receiving them understands the quiet concern carried behind those seemingly ordinary questions. At other times, a message arrives at the end of the day, when everything has finally settled, when each of them has returned to their own space after a long day with hardly a moment to rest. There is little to say, just a few familiar sentences, repeated in a steady rhythm like a habit formed without anyone quite noticing when it began. There is no need to recount the day in detail or offer lengthy explanations. The messages simply appear, gently enough to remind the other that they have not been forgotten amid the piling busyness. They come quietly, sufficient to ease some of the fatigue accumulated over the long day, enough to bring a sense of familiarity and reassurance. These messages are not elaborate, nor do they carry openly expressed emotions or grand words. They revolve around the smallest, most ordinary things, questions anyone could ask, yet ones that hold a particular meaning when sent consistently. It is precisely this simplicity that lets the recipient know that, on the other end, there is someone quietly thinking of them, still setting aside a silent measure of attention amid the countless concerns of the day. Over time, these simple questions, repeated steadily through busy days, gradually become a quiet thread that ties them together. The thread is not visible, does not need to be named or spoken of, yet it persists in the spaces between moments. It appears in the waiting when a message arrives later than usual, in the act of picking up the phone, setting it down, then picking it up once more. It lives in the familiar feeling that comes each time the other person's name lights up on the screen, even if it is only a single, brief line. Without noise or display, that slender thread silently keeps them connected, weaving through crowded rhythms of life and hurried passing days, so that even as each of them moves within their own separate orbit, they still sense the other's presence, quietly and enduringly. Within a world that never stops moving one day, while eating lunch, Tiu San suddenly felt a wave of intense nausea. The sensation came on quite abruptly, without warning, causing her to pause in the middle of the meal. The hand holding her spoon slowly lowered it to the rim of the bowl, and movements that were usually automatic suddenly felt heavier than usual. She sat still for a few seconds, clearly sensing the discomfort rising from her stomach and spreading through her body. Tiu San tried to steady herself, taking a few deep breaths, telling herself that it was probably due to the past few days of exhaustion, working continuously from early morning until late at night, eating irregularly, and that her body was simply reacting. A familiar thought crossed her mind about her old stomach problems, which often resurfaced whenever she was under prolonged stress or neglected to take proper care of herself. She tried to regain her composure, picked up the spoon once more, and ate a few more bites very slowly, each small mouthful taken as if to test whether her body could tolerate it. But the discomfort refused to let go, growing even more pronounced. Her throat tightened, her stomach churned, and wave after wave of nausea rose, making it impossible for her to continue eating normally. Tiu San had no choice but to put the spoon down again, lift a hand to cover her mouth, and sit quietly for a moment, closing her eyes and hoping the sensation would pass as it had before. She remained still over the unfinished lunch, trying to regulate her breathing and listen to her body, hoping the discomfort would gradually subside if she waited patiently. Yet time dragged on, and the nausea persisted, stubborn and unrelenting, showing no sign of easing as she had hoped. Although she tried to stay calm and reassure herself with familiar explanations, a vague sense of unease began to stir inside Tiu San, subtle, but enough to keep her from dismissing it as nothing more than ordinary fatigue, not wanting anyone to worry. Especially Tiu San decided to keep this to herself. She told herself that there was no need to mention it just yet, particularly when everyone was already caught up in work and personal concerns. In her mind, the discomfort that had appeared at lunchtime could be explained in the most familiar ways: accumulated exhaustion over many consecutive days, irregular meals, or simply the return of her old stomach condition whenever her body grew weak. Thinking this way, Tiu San tried to reassure herself, brushing aside the unease that had briefly surfaced, telling herself that she was used to such discomforts and that everything would soon be fine. She continued working at her stall until the market closed, doing her best to keep to her usual routine. Although she still felt slightly unwell, Tiu San carefully finished her tasks, revealing nothing out of the ordinary. As customers gradually thinned out, she slowly packed up the stall, neatly arranging the last baskets of vegetables, gathering her belongings and wiping down the counter as she did every day. All the movements were familiar, though each one seemed a little slower than usual. Once everything was in order, Tiu San quietly left the market. Instead of going straight home, she turned toward the familiar clinic she had visited many times before whenever she wasn't feeling well. Her steps were more measured than usual, yet in her heart she held on to the thought that this was a minor matter, not worth troubling or worrying anyone. Tiu San believed she only needed a brief checkup, a bit of advice from the doctor, and a few pills like before, and that everything would soon return to normal. Just as she had always silently carried herself through the weariness of life all these years. At the familiar clinic, Tiu San sat waiting for her turn in a quiet space that had long since become familiar to her. Plastic chairs were lined up against the wall, white lights spread evenly across the room, and the faint scent of antiseptic lingered in the air, calling back memories of previous visits for similar bouts of fatigue. She sat upright, her hands neatly resting on her lap, her gaze fixed on an indistinct point ahead, trying to keep her mind steady. Deep down, she still believed this was just a routine checkup, nothing worth worrying about. When her name was called, Tusen stepped into the examination room with unhurried steps. She sat down in front of the doctor and briefly described the intense nausea and the lingering exhaustion she had been feeling over the past few days. Her voice remained calm and even, as though she were recounting something familiar, something that had happened many times before. She did not add anything more, nor did she emphasize the severity of the discomfort, because in her mind it was only a passing spell of fatigue, a normal bodily reaction after days of overwork. The doctor listened, nodded, and began the examination carefully. His questions revolved around her daily routine, sleeping habits, eating patterns, and recent health. Tusen answered each one slowly, occasionally pausing for a few seconds to recall details, but overall she maintained her composure. In her thoughts, she held firmly to the idea that once the examination was over, the doctor would prescribe the usual medication, advise her to rest, and she would return to the rhythm of her everyday life. After a while, the doctor suddenly paused. He looked up at Tusen, his expression more intent, and then asked, gently, almost casually, a completely unexpected question about a missed period. The question echoed softly in the small room, not loud, yet enough to leave Tusen stunned. She froze for a moment, unable to respond right away. Her gaze wavered slightly, as if she had not yet grasped the meaning of what had just been mentioned, or perhaps was not ready to think any further about it. A brief silence settled between them. In that moment, Tusen felt her heartbeat slow, her mind suddenly empty. The familiar explanations, fatigue, stomach trouble, were pushed aside, making room for a strange, vague, yet unmistakable sensation. She remained seated, her fingers tightening slightly, her eyes no longer as focused as before. Not giving her much time to dwell on it, the doctor added a few calm, measured explanations and then suggested that she undergo some tests to be sure. Tusen listened in silence, asked no questions, and simply nodded by reflex. When she stood up and stepped away from the chair, her movements were slower than when she had entered, as though she were carrying an invisible weight. In that moment, the midday nausea seemed to fade, replaced by a quiet confusion that spread silently within her, following her out of the clinic, unnamed and unexplained. When the doctor informed her that she was pregnant, Tusen went completely still. The words were spoken in a calm, matter-of-fact tone, like any ordinary medical information, yet when they reached her ears, they carried an unexpected weight. They fell straight into an empty space inside her, causing all the thoughts she had carefully arranged to shatter at once, breaking apart in an instant. Tusen remained seated, her back straight, but it felt as though all strength had drained from her body. Her gaze fixed on a vague point in front of her, not truly seeing anything, merely drifting into the air without focus. She could still hear the doctor continuing with a few explanations, but her mind seemed to slow, every sound passing by from a great distance, too far away for her to fully grasp its meaning. For a moment, Tusen did not react. She did not ask any questions, did not nod or shake her head, and did not even know what expression would be appropriate. Her body remained there, yet her mind felt held somewhere else entirely. What she sensed most clearly was her heartbeat, not rapid, but slower, heavier, each beat resonating distinctly in her chest. Her breathing deepened and slowed, as if her body needed extra time to adjust to what she had just heard. The shock came too suddenly, carrying with it a tangle of overlapping emotions she herself could not yet name. In the first instant of stunned silence, a very faint joy flickered through her, so light it was almost nothing more than a fragile tremor. That joy was incomplete, never blooming, appearing only briefly before giving way to a quiet, rising confusion. Disjointed thoughts began to surface in her mind, not yet able to form into anything clear. They brushed against one another in fragments, leaving her feeling both unsettled and strangely empty, as though she were standing before a threshold without knowing whether she was ready to step across it. Tusen continued to sit there, her hands resting lightly on her lap, her fingers unconsciously tightening and then relaxing again. She breathed slowly, trying to maintain a composed exterior, as though she needed more time for both her body and her mind to catch up with the reality that had just opened before her. Everything had happened too quickly, too abruptly, leaving her unable to sort through her emotions just yet. When she left the clinic, Tusen walked more slowly than when she had entered. Her steps were no longer decisive, each one seemed to carry its own silence. The world outside remained unchanged, the hallway was still quiet, the lights still evenly lit, the footsteps of others occasionally echoing before dissolving back into stillness. Nothing appeared different, nothing hinted that something significant had just occurred. Yet within her, something had quietly shifted. Tusen stepped out carrying a sacred secret held close to her heart, something not yet spoken aloud, not yet shared with anyone, simply present, following her out of the clinic and back into the familiar rhythm of life. Leaving behind a hollow space within her, both unfamiliar and weighted with a gentle, uncertain heaviness. In the days that followed, Tusen kept the joyful news to herself. She continued with her daily routine as usual, still going out to the garden early each morning, still standing at her stall in the market, doing her best to make everything appear unchanged, as though nothing at all had shifted. The news she had just learned was tucked deep inside her, unspoken and unshared, as if by keeping silent, the swirl of emotions within her might gradually settle with time. Tusen told herself that she needed a little more calm, a little more time to slowly grow accustomed to this new reality before facing anyone else. When she spoke with Hai on the phone or through messages, she kept her familiar tone. If Hai asked how she was, she simply said she felt a bit tired, probably from working too much lately and not having fully recovered. She said nothing more, revealing nothing out of the ordinary in her words, keeping the conversation as simple as possible. Hearing this, Hai merely reminded her to get more rest, and Tusen softly responded, just as she always had before. Yet when she was alone, there were very small moments she could not stop from happening. Each time she absent-mindedly placed a hand on her stomach, whether while standing still for a moment or sitting to rest after a long day, Tusen felt something quietly different. It was not clear or tangible, but it was enough to soften her heart. In those moments, a gentle smile would naturally appear on her face, slow and discreet. It was a smile meant for no one else but herself, a faint expression of a joy that was silently growing, held close in the quiet, while the days continued to pass as they always had, until the day Hai came to visit. Tusen had managed to keep everything wrapped in her familiar appearance of normalcy. But this time, he witnessed it with his own eyes, her sudden wave of nausea, the way she had to turn away in haste, her face draining of color, her breathing heavier than usual. When the discomfort passed, Tusen sat quietly on a chair, leaning back against the edge of the table, her body slack with exhaustion, no longer strong enough to conceal it as she had before. Hai stood there, seeing clearly the frailty on her face, noticing her hands tremble slightly as she tried to steady herself, and in that moment, he could no longer accept the familiar explanations she had always given. He pressed her with questions, his voice unable to hide his worry, then firmly said he would take her to see a doctor right away. Out of habit, Tusen tried to refuse, saying that a short rest would be enough, but the resolve in Hai's eyes stopped her from saying anything more. He did not scold her, nor did he raise his voice. He simply began to arrange things quietly, as if he had already decided that he would no longer let her handle everything on her own. In that moment, when her body felt unmistakably weak, when the fatigue and dizziness no longer allowed her to keep things hidden, Tusen suddenly felt the defenses in her heart soften and give way. She sat still, breathing slowly, then spoke in a very soft voice, almost a whisper. There was no more circling around, no more avoidance. Tusen told him the truth she had kept hidden for days. The words fell gently, yet carried all the trembling, confusion, and unnamed emotion within them, as if even she herself had only just found enough courage to acknowledge it in that very moment. Thai was deeply moved as he pulled Tiu San into a tight embrace, his arms tightening as if afraid that letting go might cause the moment to slip away. He did not speak right away, only held her for a long time in silence, clearly feeling the faint trembling in her body, as though he wanted to pass on to her all the steadiness he possessed. Within that embrace, Tiu San no longer had to struggle to remain composed or hide her emotions. She leaned gently into him, allowing the fatigue and the many overlapping feelings she had carried for so long to slowly settle. When he saw the ultrasound image with his own eyes, Hai could hardly look away from the small picture in front of him. His gaze was slow and intent, filled with an emotion he made no attempt to conceal. In that moment, all the worries, busyness, and pressures of life seemed to fall into the background. Before him remained only a sense of wholeness, warm, profound, and difficult to put into words. Happiness welled up quietly, without noise or display, yet deeply, spreading through his eyes and every measured breath. Hai clasped Tiu San's hand tightly, giving it a gentle squeeze, a wordless affirmation. To him, that ultrasound result was not merely medical information, but the greatest gift of his life, something sacred that arrived when he least expected it. In that moment, he felt with unmistakable clarity that his life had crossed into a new place, where joy, responsibility, and love existed together, complete, enduring, and irreplaceable. From that moment on, Hai stayed by Tiu San's side, caring for her in every small way, without noise or display, simply present through a steady, tangible concern. He paid attention to each subtle change in her, from her meals and sleep to the moments when she felt more tired than usual. Sometimes it was just a gentle reminder for her to rest earlier. Other times, it was his quiet presence beside her, saying nothing, yet allowing her to feel clearly that she no longer had to manage everything on her own as before. These gestures came naturally, as if they had always existed, only now revealing themselves fully. Under the soft sunlight of mornings and the slow passage of gentle afternoons, the two of them held hands and walked side by side at an unhurried pace. There was no need for many words, no need for spoken promises. Their closeness showed itself in the way Hai held Tiu San's hand light yet firm, and in the way she leaned into him with a rare sense of reassurance. The surroundings remained familiar, life continued as it always had, yet between them a new connection had formed, deeper and quieter. Within that calm, the two of them slowly welcomed a new beginning, unhurried, unspoken, yet full of love and hope. There was no need to name or arrange what lay ahead just yet. It was enough to know that, in this moment, they were together, sharing a sacred joy that had only just begun to take root, allowing the gentle sunlight to spread and envelop them both in a deeply real sense of peace.
Xin chào tất cả mọi người đã quay trở lại với kênh của mình. Hôm nay thì mình vẫn đang tiếp tục làm video nha mọi người. Bữa nay thì ở chỗ mình khá là lạnh, gần tới Giáng sinh rồi, thì gần tới Giáng sinh các nhân vật cũng đã đang tham dự Giáng sinh rất là nhiều. Hôm nay thì mình đang tiếp tục hoàn thành các video, thì mình sẽ cố gắng hoàn thành sớm nhất để có thể đăng tải lên cho mọi người vào lúc 7 giờ tối. Một số kênh thì mình sẽ cho nó đăng tải lên vào lúc 7 giờ sáng. Mong rằng mọi người sẽ yêu quý và ủng hộ cho kênh mình thật là nhiều nha. Mình đang trong bước đặt tên video. Tạm biệt mọi người.